Hands of the week. Let's do a hand that one of the best players who's ever played on Hustler played. We open to 150 from +1 here. We're playing 25-50 with a $50 big blind ante with pocket twos. RJ calls in the cutoff. The Golden State Warriors fan. I'm a fan of the Golden State Warriors.
You
too,
are.
So.
Isn't he also? Is that a Barcelona hat?
I don't know anything about synchronized rugby. Tal's gonna come along from the small blind coin flex man. What kind of name is coin flex man?
Phenomenal businesses that are in no way a Ponzi or rug pull.
All right, so we're gonna go 4 ways to this flop.
Just in general, calling Queen 10 off is probably not a great decision from almost any position besides the big blind. What we talk about in the stable, when they go,
hey, what should I do on this river?
We tend to often have to pull it all the way back and say, well, you could have just folded pre-flop.
It's kind of like saying I dressed up in a hot dog suit and did some meth and rolled around on the ground. And then I ended up at this old lady's house and she gave me some lasagna and I ate the lasagna and it wasn't very good. Should I have ate the lasagna? Flop is Jack 9 deuce with a couple of spades.
This hand may have gone off the rails a little bit.
So it checks to us. The small blind and the big blind check. Now it's on us. And I think since there's only one player left to act behind us, we probably just want to be doing a lot of betting here instead of checking. If we were +1 here and got called by low jack cutoff button, maybe checking here would make a lot of sense because on this wet dynamic board, people are just going to bet all their jack X, bet all their draws, etc., etc. But when we have only one player left behind to act here, we want to make sure this flop doesn't check through, especially when we flop a big bedazzled boy hand like this. So I decided to go for a round half pot here.
How did you come up with the half pot, or was this just you just grabbing some chips?
I'm choosing the biggest size where they're still going to continue with gut shots and still going to raise off their top pair, top kicker, or combo draws.
I think the only exception to that smaller size that allows them to raise off is when you're playing against players who are just so passive that you don't trust that they will ever raise a hand like ace jack and that they won't be raising even combo draws. And then sometimes we have the expression, you just have to put the money in for them.
All right, so I go 300 and RJ calls next to act, which when you're calling next to act, you're going to have to be tighter continuing because you still have multiple players behind you who could wake up with a hand. I think when RJ calls next to act, it's probably going to be weighted more towards jack X and draws than hands like 9X. And then we get to Tal, and Tal here is actually going to raise to $1,000. So kind of a small raise once a bet and a call. And now it gets back to me, and I think this is the first interesting decision point of the hand. And I think this is my first blunder of many blunders in this hand. Look how deep we are. Right. We start this hand, I don't know how many big blinds that is. Is that 600 big blinds?
And at least 300 effective with RJ.
And I think when you're that deep in a single raise pot, your incentive is to start piling in more money with your good hands. And we have a very good hand. We can cooler some of Tal's value, like Jack 9. I think just putting in the bet 3-bet here, maybe going 3K, 3,500, I think would be a much better decision than the decision I chose.
Do you think the fact that Tal used this much smaller size more indicative of, say, a Jack X?
Sure.
Is what he has?
Sure, it could just be Jack X, but also I don't think Jack X is folding to a bet 3-bet because we've done another hand like this where I actually played versus Masato, who's sitting right next to me right there, where Masato bet 3-bet and I didn't fold top pair because bet 3-bets are usually full of shit.
You punished me.
Punish.
Fill big pots with big hands.
This is why people pay us. So I call here, which I think is a egregious blunder. And
I like the word egregious.
RJ, the fan of the synchronized rugby team, he is also going to come along as well.
Once you've got to this point with an open ender and a backdoor flush draw and only having to put $700 more into a pot that's kind of ballooned.
The
hand balloon chart.
All right, so now here on the turn, Tal goes 2,000 into 3,600. And I think my decision on the turn here is a little bit easier because I think when we call the check raise on the flop, I think raising the turn now, it just looks super strong.
Talk a little bit about your turn raising philosophy in live poker.
I think
I have an itchy breast. Just like right under the nipple.
When was the last time you played a hand of live poker and you got raised on the turn after taking an aggressive action pre-flop and an aggressive action on the flop where they did not have the nuts?
I believe it was 1993.
Essentially, turn raises and river raises are extremely under bluffed. When people see a turn raise or a river raise, alarm bells start going off in their head and they start folding some pretty good hands. So I kind of use this line much more heavily weighted towards bluffs than I do value. And I think if we're thinking about this spot, my incentive with a very good hand is to get value. And I think if we raise this turn, I think we just start folding out a lot of Tal's kind of like medium strength hands, which he's representing with this sizing. Whereas I think if we bet 3-bet the flop, that's more often seen as bullshit. So bet 3-betting the flop with a good hand makes a lot of sense. Raising the turn with a good hand just looks very, very strong because that's how most people play good hands.
Can I play devil's advocate for a moment?
Play devil's advocate for a moment.
It's quite feasible that one of them has a draw. Does that lead you to be more tempted to potentially raise the turn? The time that people put money in with draws are when they are still drawing. If, for example, RJ has a flush draw or a straight draw, is this not an opportunity to have him pay more to chase and hit his draw?
If I raise here, even if RJ has a good draw, if it goes bet, raise, and now he's next to act and he's got to worry about tall behind him, I think that's just going to fold out a lot of draws from RJ. Now, I don't know who has the draw in game. I think one of these two guys almost certainly has a draw, but I think if it's RJ behind, if I raise, he's going to fold. And the worst case scenario for me here is if Tall has a hand like Ace Jack or King Jack and I raise and then RJ folds a draw behind and then Tall folds the Ace Jack or King. So those were kind of some of the things going through my head. I like not raising the turn. I hate not bet 3-betting the flop.
Which of them do you think is more weighted towards draws and which of them do you think is more weighted to perhaps top pair hands like that?
Yeah, I think Tall is probably more weighted towards draws because I don't expect people to necessarily check raise this board thinly and follow up with a turn barrel. So I think if you start off with a small bet on the flop, people do raise King Jack and Ace Jack for protection, but I think then they kind of slow down and go into maybe like a check call shell.
Particularly multi-way, when you get called in two spots, he's found a small size into two players with top pair good kicker, and that I would say is somewhat rare from the general population of live poker who struggle to bet thinly for value, particularly multi-way.
3 ways to the river. Pot is 9,600. Tom goes 4,000 here, and now the decision is back to us. Here's my thoughts on this river. Tall check raises the flop. He bets the turn into 2 other people, and then bets the river into 2 other people after he gets called on the flop and turn. I thought on the turn that Tall is not going to be check raising Jack X on the flop and then betting again on the turn. I think a lot of those hands check. So I think in this particular scenario, Tall is heavily weighted towards draws, and I think RJ is going to have a lot of Jack X. So I think here, what happens if I raise RJ, who's going to have a Jack behind a lot? He's got to worry about Tall again behind him, who's taken nothing but aggressive action. I think RJ, if I raise here, he may fold a hand like Queen Jack, King Jack here a good percentage of the time, and then I think Tall just has a bunch of busted draws, and then maybe occasionally a hand like Jack 9, which we lose to. So I couldn't really figure out a good reason to raise here. I think in retrospect, what happens if we click this to 10K? Well, I don't think RJ folds Ace Jack or King Jack. And I think if we click it to 10K and Tall bet 3 bets, well, now we just have a very easy decision. We fold because we don't beat anything that takes this line from Tall.
Yeah, I would push back a little bit, just given that RJ has about $12,500 effective. If I think he's calling a click, then I think he's calling for all his chips. And I want to make sure that if he does have a Jack here, I win the absolute max. This would be the thought experiment I would do. If he accidentally flipped over Jack 10, would I think, oh, what a good opportunity if I was bluffing to get him to fold?
Yeah.
And I think the answer is a definitive no. And therefore, the other side of that coin would be, okay, if I think he often has a Jack here, I want to make sure that I stack him.
So raise this to 13K. With all that in mind, let's go ahead and watch what I did on this river. I hope you guys enjoy.
He's a little worried about pocket 9s. He just calls. He's going to get roasted for that in the chat.
Right then.